Good afternoon. Happy Friday. Beautiful day outside today. Nice to have another week finished as we march along through this unusual semester. So on Wednesday, we began to discuss Judaism. And I concluded my first lecture by talking about the great prophet Moses, the greatest prophet in Judaism. And I ran out of time, so I didn't get to cover all of it. But we concluded at about the point of the Exodus. And the Exodus is this critical moment in the Torah where Moses is called by Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to go and to demand that the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, release the Israelites who are in bondage there, and then he leads them out of Egypt, and they enter into the wilderness of the Sinai. So if you'd like to look at some more details about the Exodus, please have a look at the last slides of the first lecture. If you have any questions about it, feel free to email me. But beyond that, I want to pick up with Moses and the Israelites in the Sinai today. So here's a map showing the location of the Sinai Peninsula. And according to the story in the Torah, this is where Moses and the Israelites end up after they flee Egypt. Today, the Sinai is part of Egypt. It's part of the Arab Republic of Egypt. And Moses is called by Yahweh, the God who commanded him to go and liberate the Israelites from Egypt, to go up a mountain. And this is known as Mount Sinai. The exact location of the mountain isn't known to us, but if you go and visit the Sinai today, the tourist guides will point you in the direction of a particular mountain, which local tradition says is Mount Sinai. It's not really much of a mountain, but what mountain was actually being referred to by the scribes who composed the Torah, that remains a mystery to us. So Moses goes up the mountain, and he goes up there to commune with Yahweh. And while he's up there receiving new divine revelation from Yahweh, the Israelites that he left down below end up going astray. They get impatient. Moses is gone. He's gone up the mountain. And so some troublemakers amongst them persuade the Israelites to construct a golden calf, a false idol, and to begin to worship this false idol in the absence of Moses. So while Moses is up there receiving divine revelation, this bad stuff is happening down at the base of the mountain. Well, Moses receives, according to rabbinic tradition, the whole of the Torah during this event. And the Jewish scholars, the rabbis, would later identify no less than 613 mitzvot, or commandments, that the Israelites are supposed to follow from the pages of the Torah. But there are 10 among those 613 that are inscribed on 2 tablets of stone, the tablets of the law, and received by Moses on the mountain, which he then delivers to the people, having come down from Mount Sinai. Now, when he comes down from the mountain, he finds that they built this false idol, and they've gone astray. And in his anger, he actually smashes and destroys the original stone tablets. He then calls for the Israelites to choose sides, and the side that's loyal to Moses ends up slaughtering the side that worshiped the golden calf. So the Israelites are purified through this bloodletting. Then Moses gets some replacement tablets, and those tablets are what we know as the 10 Commandments. So let's have a look at the 10 Commandments. These are pretty well known, but it's worth going through them again with you. So the first of the 10 Commandments on the tablets of the law that the prophet Moses receives at Sinai states, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." Okay, so on the surface, this is a statement affirming monotheism, belief in one God. But the phrasing is really unique, right? It doesn't say there's only one God. It said, "Have no other gods before me." That's a curious way to phrase it. And some scholars think that this unusual wording reflects early Israelite monolatry rather than monotheism. So monolatry means that you worship one God, but other people might have their own gods as well, right? So we, the Israelites, worship our God, Yahweh, while the Amalekites and the Egyptians over there, they worship their own gods. And that phrasing seems to be in line with that kind of sentiment. But there's no doubt that as Judaism develops over time, that Judaism becomes monotheistic. Monotheism being that only one God exists, as opposed to monarchy, where you're worshiping one God, but other gods might exist as well. So early on, this could have had a kind of monolatrous meaning to it, but it certainly gets to be understood over time as a profession of monotheism. There's only one God. Number two, thou shalt not make for yourself an image and worship them. So no idolatry, no graven images. One of the things that was really common in the ancient Middle East is that the different peoples of the region used to build statues to represent their gods. Right? If you look at the ruins of ancient Egypt, you'll see old statues depicting deities like Horus and Anubis and Amun-Ra and all these different deities. And that was certainly true of the Babylonians and the Assyrians and other peoples throughout the region. The Greeks and the Romans did the same. But the Israelites sort of stand out from the crowd in the fact that they don't depict their God, they don't depict Yahweh as a statue, as a personified being. Instead, Yahweh is transcendent, and you don't depict Yahweh through a statue or any other physical depiction. Number three, thou shalt not misuse the name of God. So you don't use the Lord's name in vain. That's the common way in which we tend to phrase it these days. So the name of God that was revealed to Moses out of the burning bush before he goes and leads the Israelites out of bondage in Egypt is Yahweh. And that name is considered to be so sacred that you're not supposed to use it in everyday mundane usage. And you certainly don't want to use it in any kind of potentially insulting way. So the tradition that developed out of this commandment is don't say the name at all. And a common substitute, and this is still done in Orthodox Judaism, is to use the word Hashem instead. Hashem literally means the name. Ha in Hebrew is the definite article. It means the. And then Shem means name. So Hashem literally means the name. So instead of saying Yahweh, it's common for Orthodox devout Jews to say Hashem instead, or use some other substitute in place of the sacred name. Number four, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So in my first lecture on Judaism, I told you the Israelite creation story found in the first book of the Torah, the book that we know as Genesis. And in that story, it describes God, or Elohim, creating the world over a span of 6 days. And after creating everything, on the seventh day, Elohim rests. And that seventh day, that day of rest, is instituted into Jewish practice as a day in which Jews are not supposed to work, and instead engage in worship and contemplation and reflection. So the Sabbath day is the seventh day. What is the seventh day? Well, I'm sure many of you are thinking, oh, it's Sunday. And in Judaism, no, it's not. The seventh day is Saturday. So in Christianity, which we'll be studying later, the seventh day is Sunday. It's the day in which Jesus rises from the dead. So that becomes the Christian Sabbath. But in Judaism, the Sabbath is Saturday, or more specifically, in the Jewish reckoning of a day, the day starts with the night preceding the day. So right now, as I'm speaking to you, it's Friday, and when the sun sets tonight, that'll be the start of the Sabbath. That marks the start of the day, and then it'll proceed until the sun sets on Saturday. So that will be the Sabbath. So in terms of daylight hours, the Jewish Sabbath is Saturday, even though it technically starts when the sun sets on Friday. So for that time, Jews are expected to not work in any capacity. And then there's the question of, well, what constitutes work? It's not just not going to your 9-to-5 job. It's anything that could be work. So subsequent Jewish scholars, the rabbis, begin to lay out what exactly constitutes work. And they would specify things like, well, you can't cook a meal. That's work. You can't build a fire. That's work. In modern times, some of the rabbis would say you can't drive a car. That's work. So it becomes quite restrictive, but it's subject to different interpretations. And we'll talk more about the Sabbath in my third lecture on Judaism. The fifth of the 10 Commandments, honor your father and mother. And then 6 through 10, don't commit murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie, don't covet your neighbor's property. So I've paraphrased the 10 commandments, the commandments on the stone tablets given to Moses at Sinai from the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verses 1 through 17. The book of Exodus being one of the 5 books of the Torah. Those stone tablets are said to have then been placed within a special vessel called the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the Ark of the Covenant doesn't exist today. No one's sure at what point it disappeared or what happened to it. So this is a modern reproduction of what it's thought to have looked like. And so this was used to carry the stone tablets, which symbolizes the special relationship between Yahweh and the Israelites, the symbol of the covenant. And it becomes, in effect, in lieu of a statue of Yahweh, this becomes the closest thing to a physical representation of Yahweh on earth, the Ark of the Covenant. Now, at this point in the Torah, we're told that Moses and the Israelites are still wandering in the wilderness of the Sinai, right? They have left Egypt, but they haven't arrived in their ultimate destination, which is the land promised to Abraham and his descendants. So they keep that Ark of the Covenant, that special vessel holding the tablets of the law, in this portable temple of sorts called the Tabernacle. And the Tabernacle is essentially made out of material that you would use to construct a tent. So you've got, some type of canvas-like fabric, you have ropes and spikes and so forth, because the people are moving. So you have to be able to transport it. And if we look at the layout, it's very similar to other sacred spaces that we've seen in other religious traditions. We have an outer courtyard of sorts where people can enter, but then there is an inner sanctuary, an inner sanctum, where the physical representation of the deity is kept. So in this case, instead of a statue or a murti like we see in Hinduism, or a shentai like we see in the Shinto tradition, the representation of the deity of Yahweh here is the Ark of the Covenant. And it's kept in a space that's known as the Holy of Holies. This is, in essence, the presence of Yahweh on earth, and only the Israelite priests can enter this sacred space. In the courtyard itself, we have a couple of objects. We have a basin for the performance of ritual ablutions for purification, and we have an altar for sacrifices. So the way in which Yahweh is worshipped, if you want to show gratitude to Yahweh, or you want to atone for a sin, you broke a commandment and you need to atone for it, the way in which you do that is through animal sacrifice. So it could be a sheep, a goat, it could be a cow, it could be a dove. That blood is the most sacred substance on earth, and so blood is the means by which you atone for the sacrifice. And a portion of the animal would be presented as a burnt offering on the altar here. So once you get to the end of the life of Moses, you have reached the end of the Torah, those first 5 books. But there are more Jewish texts, many more in fact. So moving beyond the 5 books of the Torah, we get to a new collection of documents that are called the Nevi'im. Nevi'im means the prophets. And there, as the name indicates, we have stories of many different Israelite prophets after Moses. But I want to talk about one period in particular, and that is the time in which the Jewish or Israelite monarchy emerges. So once the Israelites have left the Sinai and settled in the land of Canaan, they then establish a government for themselves. And it's a monarchy. Right? So you have a line of kings. Democracy doesn't exist in the Bible. It's all about monarchy. Both the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Jewish scriptures and the Christian scriptures, it's all about monarchy. And so that's what the Israelites establish. And the first king of the Israelites is Saul. So Saul is the king, and he's busy fighting off rival peoples in Canaan. He's particularly occupied battling the Philistines of Gaza. And we're told that Saul goes astray. Saul ends up doing some bad things. One of the things he does is consult a necromancer, someone who consults the spirits of the dead, and that's a no-no. And so Saul loses Yahweh's favor. In essence, if we can use a term that I used in our study of religions in China, he lost the mandate of heaven. So Yahweh is displeased. Yahweh withdraws his favor from Saul, and Saul ends up dying in battle. So after Saul's death, we see the rise of a new king, a king who was in fact a son-in-law of Saul, and someone who was already a heroic figure. This is David. So the Hebrew scriptures, the Tanakh, say that David, as a young man, fought and killed the Philistine giant Goliath. That the Philistines, this enemy of the Israelites, had a giant champion named Goliath, and all the Israelite warriors were afraid to fight him, but young David heroically goes and faces him and actually defeats him with a rock and a sling, strikes Goliath in the head, and then cuts off his head. Here we can see a depiction of David raising the severed head of Goliath the giant in victory. And of course, you've all heard the phrase David and Goliath. It's kind of this archetypal symbol for the underdog, right? Of someone battling, someone who's bigger, stronger, more powerful, and yet succeeding nonetheless. Well, it's that same young champion who ends up becoming the new king of Israel. And it's King David who is celebrated more than any other Jewish king. He is sort of elevated to being symbolic of a kind of Jewish golden age, a time of great strength and prosperity for the Israelites, a time in which the Israelites were united as one single kingdom, and God's favor was with them. So what do we know about King David? Well, we don't have any information about him outside of the Jewish Bible, outside of the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh. So scholars, because that material was written well after the events they describe, scholars question whether that religious material is in any way a fair representation of a historical person that once existed. And some scholars thought for a while that David could be a kind of mythological king, almost like a King Arthur in British culture. But there was a recent archaeological discovery where archaeologists found an inscription that made reference to the house of David. And that was the first time anyone had ever found such a thing. And so based on that discovery, scholars are now rethinking their previous conclusions about David and theorizing that, okay, there may well have been a King David. Now, that said, that inscription didn't provide any biographical details. So whether or not the accounts we get in the Hebrew Bible accurately reflect a historical King David, that's something that people still debate. But let me present to you the information in a concise way, of course, that we get about David from the Hebrew Bible itself. So it tells us that David was born in Bethlehem, and he became king of Israel at the age of 30. Now, as was the norm, the existing practice, when you become king of Israel, you go through a coronation process, right? It's sort of like the oath of office. When you become president, you go through the oath of office. When you become king of Israel or king of other lands or kingdoms, you go through a coronation ceremony by which your reign starts. Well, for the Israelites, that coronation ceremony entailed a ritual anointing with sacred oil. And so the kings were referred to as Mushiah, which means anointed one. Or the English rendering of that word is Messiah. So a Jewish king was an anointed one, a Messiah, the one who leads the Israelites and is the primary earthly intermediary between the Israelites and their God, Yahweh. And so in that role, one of the other honorary titles that the Mashiach, the anointed one, the Messiah, the king would receive was Son of God. And we see David referred to as Son of God in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible as well. We've seen similar titles. For example, when we were studying religions in China, I talked about the fact that the emperor of China was called the son of Tian, the son of heaven, the kind of intermediary between heaven and earth. Something similar here, except now we're talking about Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Bible says that David succeeds in conquering the city of Jerusalem, which had been a Canaanite city, and he makes that city his capital. And because of that conquest, even today in the 21st century, Jerusalem is still referred to as the city of David. His rule is actually quite turbulent the Hebrew Bible doesn't at all give us a kind of sanitized, rosy picture of his rule. In fact, it depicts David doing some bad things, like coveting another man's wife and then taking her husband and putting on the front lines of a battle so he dies so he can take her wife and things like that. So interesting, right? It's interesting reading. But he would still become very much this paradigm, this sort of peak of the Israelite kingdom, and one that is still celebrated to the present. So David himself had many wives and concubines and many children as well, but he is succeeded by his son Solomon. And Solomon is celebrated in the Hebrew Bible as a man of profound wisdom. He is sort of the paradigm of the wise king, and subsequent Jewish thinkers as well as Christian and Muslim thinkers would be fascinated by the extent of Solomon's wisdom, and various later texts would talk about him possessing knowledge even of things like magic and the ability to control spirits and demons and all kinds of interesting things. Well, it's during the reign of King Solomon that the old tabernacle, that portable temple that housed the Ark of the Covenant, is replaced with a permanent stone temple in Jerusalem. That temple no longer exists, but this is a model depicting what it probably looked like. So this is the Temple of Solomon, the temple devoted to the worship of Yahweh. Here we can see the outer courtyard, and then this is the inner sanctum or sanctuary that houses the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred place on earth. So once this temple is built under the reign of King Solomon, this becomes the focal point of Yahweh worship, right? If you want to go and worship Yahweh, perform your animal sacrifices, you have to go to the sacred temple in Jerusalem. This is the place to go. It is the holiest place on earth. It is, in essence, the closest you can get to God on earth, right? This is his presence in our world. Well, he builds this, and you have all these rituals going on there, and you have the priest there, but Solomon, despite his wisdom, ends up going astray. He's got lots of wives. He's a polygamist, and that polygamy was common at the time. And he's got lots of concubines, and some of his wives are foreigners, and they worship foreign gods. And he allows for his wives to continue to worship those gods, and even allows them to set up shop in Jerusalem and in the precincts of the temple. Well, that's a no-no. That would be a violation of the commandments. Thou shalt not take any other gods before me, so on and so forth, no graven images. And so because of that, Yahweh's wrath comes down, but because we're told he loves David, Solomon's father, so much, he decides to postpone his punishment until after the reign of Solomon. So when Solomon dies, it's under his successors that the once united kingdom of Israel ends up splitting, fracturing into two separate kingdoms. So this is understood by the Jewish scribes as being a consequence of Solomon's mistake, his error, allowing his wives to engage in idolatry. So then we have the existence of two Jewish or Israelite kingdoms. On this map, we can see the two kingdoms. We've got a northern kingdom called the Kingdom of Israel, and it has a capital at Samaria. Beneath that, in the yellow on this map, we have the Kingdom of Judah with its capital at Jerusalem. Now, I talked a little bit about the Kingdom of Judah in my first lecture. I was explaining to you why the religion is called Judaism. And if you remove the ism, you get the word Judah. So that comes to us from the Kingdom of Judah. The land that the kingdom inhabited is called Judea, and it's associated with an earlier Israelite tribe, the tribe of Judah, which is the tribe from which King David came. So in the 8th century, around the year 720 BCE, the northern kingdom is invaded by the neighboring empire, the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians come in, they decimate the northern kingdom, and it ceases to exist. So then we're left only with the Kingdom of Judah, with its capital at Jerusalem. That kingdom will endure, which is one of the reasons why it's called Judaism instead of Israelism. That kingdom would endure until the 6th century BCE. What happens in the 6th century? A very important event. I know there's 4 of you watching. I've got a big crowd, 30 students in this class, and I've got 4 people watching. Pay attention to the Babylonian exile, also called the Babylonian captivity. This is the event where the Babylonian Empire off to the east now invades, conquers, and decimates the kingdom of Judah. And when they conquer the kingdom of Judah, guess what they do? They destroy Solomon's temple, the most sacred place on earth, the place where the Ark of the Covenant sits, is destroyed by the Babylonians. Not only that, guess what else they do? They kill off the princes from the royal house of David, and they take the king, they blind him and take him back as a prisoner, and he dies in exile. So the monarchy ends. No more descendants from King David, the end of the royal line. The temple is destroyed. The Ark of the Covenant may have disappeared at this point, if not a later point. We don't know exactly at what point the Ark of the Covenant disappeared. And the monarchy is ended. These fundamental pillars of ancient Judaism or Israelite religion have ended now. This is huge. And among the people who survived the Babylonian conquest, the Babylonians take all the elders, the leaders, all the most influential, wealthiest people as prisoners and take them back to Babylon. They only leave basically the Jewish Israelite peasants left behind in Judea. So this is huge. Why? Because now all these Jewish refugees who are living as prisoners in Babylon have to figure out, where do we go from here? Do we just assimilate and become Babylonians, worship their gods, speak their language, act like they act? Or do we try to preserve our distinctive Israelite identity? Well, the decision for most of them was, let's try to preserve our identity. And that necessitates writing down our traditions. So in the 6th century, the Babylonian exile is the real catalyst for the formal writing, editing, compiling of the Torah and the other sacred texts of the Jewish Bible. And we've seen this before. We've seen this in our study of other religions, that initially we have oral tradition, and then something happens where the survival of those traditions is threatened, and so they have to write it down. For example, when we studied Buddhism, we talked about how the teachings of the Buddha were passed on through oral tradition until you get to this terrible famine in Sri Lanka, where the people who had memorized those traditions are dying off, and so then they decide to create the Tripitaka to preserve that knowledge so it won't be lost. That's what happens here. The Jewish scribes now, in order to make sure that that knowledge isn't lost, that it'll survive and be able to be passed on to the next generation, that they'll be able to preserve the Jewish Israelite identity and heritage, write it down. So that's one key development. Another key development is, how do you worship Yahweh if you don't have the temple anymore? Do we just perform animal sacrifices anywhere? Or could we only do it at the temple in Jerusalem? Well, it ends up that, you can only do it at the temple in Jerusalem, so we need to do something else. This leads to the development of standardized daily prayers. The ritual of prayer becomes a substitute for the old animal sacrifices. Right? You got no temple, you can't perform the old sacrificial rites. So while living in exile, Jews begin to implement these ritual prayers as a substitute for the old sacrifices. And of course, prayer is an essential part of not only Judaism, but then the later religions of Christianity and Islam as well. If you don't have the temple and the ritual sacrifices, well, then the old Israelite priesthood, who would oversee those sacrifices, don't really have a purpose anymore. So instead, we see the emergence of a new class of Jewish scholars, the rabbis. And these rabbis possess authority based on their knowledge of the stories of the patriarchs, the story of Moses, their understanding of the rules of the covenant, all of the material that we find in what we call the Hebrew Bible today. So this class begins to emerge as a rival to, and ultimately it's going to replace, the old priesthood. Along with that, we also have the development of houses of prayer, places where Jews gathered together, especially men, to perform the new ritual prayers together. We commonly refer to those houses of assembly by the Greek name synagogue. Another term is shul. Another is Beit Knesset, an assembly house. So synagogues become these focal points for Jewish worship of Yahweh in the absence of the temple. These developments are huge, not only for subsequent development of Judaism, but also for the religions that are going to spring from Judaism, namely Christianity and Islam. So the Babylonian exile goes on for decades, and it finally concludes when a neighboring empire, the Persian Empire, conquers the Babylonian Empire. And unlike the Babylonians, the Persians under Cyrus the Great are way more tolerant. Their attitude is, as long as you acknowledge us, the Persians, as supreme, that we're in control, you guys can go home, you can worship your own gods, that's fine with us. So the Persians under Cyrus the Great allow the Jewish refugees, the exiles, to leave Babylon and go back to Judea. But not everyone goes. So some Jews go back to Judea and they begin the process of building what's called the Second Temple. Build a new temple to Yahweh so that they can resume the old rituals, the old animal sacrifices. But some stay behind in Babylon and Persia. And you might be thinking, well, why would they stay? Well, it's because Babylon and Persia at that time, that was the center of the world, right? That was the most advanced, the richest, the most cultured. That's where all the latest technology and knowledge was happening. So some people just thought, oh, there's good business opportunities here. I want to be part of this elaborate, powerful culture. So some people stayed behind. And going all the way up into the 20th century, you have the continuity of Jewish communities in countries like Iraq and Iran. In fact, while most of Iraq's Jewish community, virtually all, in fact, would migrate to the new state of Israel that was established in 1948, in Iran, what's now the Islamic Republic of Iran, there's still somewhere between 20 and 30,000 Jews. And their story, their heritage, the claim is that they go back all the way to the time of the exile, right? That's the tradition anyway. So some Jews then go back to Judea, and we have the start of the Second Temple period. We have the resumption of the old temple rituals, but now that older form of Judaism is existing side by side with this new type of Judaism that developed during the exile. And that's going to continue for centuries moving forward. This is also a time in which Jewish thinkers are encountering new types of religious ideas. The Persians have their own religion. Broadly speaking, we can describe the religion of the Persians as Zoroastrianism at this point in history. And Zoroastrianism is not an Abrahamic religion like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but it has various connections. And one of the reasons why there are some connections because of this period, where there's this interaction between Persian religious ideas and Semitic Jewish ideas. And from this point on, we begin to see new ideas and new points of emphasis in Jewish thought. Ideas that would play a big role in Christianity and Islam. For example, in my first lecture, I mentioned that there's no reference to what we call in English heaven and hell in the Torah. In the Torah, there's really no afterlife. There's just Sheol. There's a general land of the dead, an underworld, where everyone's going to go when they die, whether you're righteous or you're wicked. Everyone goes to the land of the dead. But the Persians believed that after you died, you would be judged and you would go either to a blissful paradise. And in fact, the English word paradise derives from the Persian word paradisa, which means enclosed garden. So that's a legacy of the Persian influence. The fact that we even use the word paradise to refer to heaven, the good place, or a fiery bad place. And so once we have this interaction with Persian culture, we begin to see Jews talking about this idea of an afterlife, of a heaven and hell. And of course, those ideas are core beliefs in Christianity and Islam. It's also during the Persian period that we see the end of the line of prophets. So in Judaism, there are lots of different prophets. And of course, the most important is Moses, but there are other important ones like Elijah and Isaiah and Daniel, Jeremiah. There's lots of different prophets, okay? But once you get to the Persian period, Judaism no longer recognizes any more prophets. The line of prophethood ends. Instead, all the attention and all the authority in Jewish thought is placed on the Jewish sacred texts and the scholars who interpret those texts, the scholars that we would later come to know as the rabbis. So the rabbis suddenly become the core authority in Judaism, replacing that earlier period where you had prophets of Yahweh dictating divine revelation. Now, this is important to note because if the line of prophethood ends in the 6th century BCE or the 5th century BCE, then anyone who comes after that is not considered a prophet. So that means that in Judaism, Jesus of Nazareth, who comes along much later, is not a prophet. John the Baptist is not a prophet. Muhammad is not a prophet. None of these figures are of any religious significance to Judaism. The line of prophethood ends hundreds of years before those guys. Okay? So instead, all the attention is focused on the rabbis and their understanding of the sacred texts. So let's talk about the sacred text. Since it's the center of Judaism, what is it made up of? Well, we refer to the whole of the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Bible, as the Tanakh. Now, the word Tanakh, you can see it right up there. The Tanakh is an acronym made up from the three core sections of the Hebrew Bible. The T in the word Tanakh comes from the first section, which is the Torah. And I talked all about the Torah in my first lecture. That is the section that begins with the creation of the world, Adam and Eve, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moses, right? Most of the Torah is focused on the story of Moses and the Exodus. After the 5 books of the Torah, then we get to the Nevi'im, the prophets. And I told you the stories of David and Solomon. That's where we would get that material. And then we have the third section. That's where we get the K from, and the word Tanakh. The Ketuvim. This is the most eclectic section. There's lots of different types of materials there. So you would find the book of Psalms there, Proverbs, and you find the book of Job there. So in my first lecture on Judaism, I was telling you the creation story and talking about the snake in the garden. And I pointed out the fact that in the story, it's just a snake. It's not Satan or the devil. And in fact, Satan or the devil is never mentioned in the Torah. The concept hasn't developed yet. Satan or the devil appears for the first time here in the book of Job, in the Ketuvim section of the Hebrew Bible. And then in the centuries to come, that figure, the adversary, the Satan, would be identified with the serpent. That's certainly true by the time we get to Christianity in the 1st and 2nd century of the Common Era. And then by the time you get to Islam in the 7th century, as I said, the sacred text of Islam, the Quran, explicitly identifies Satan as present. It doesn't even mention the snake. It's just Satan tempting Eve in the garden. Right? So that identification comes later, but it's not present in the Torah itself. So together, all these diverse books form the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh. Sometimes people call the Tanakh the Torah, but I like to use the term Torah to refer specifically to that one section, those first 5 books is Torah, and Tanakh to refer to the whole of the Hebrew Bible. Generally speaking, the Tanakh is what Christians call the Old Testament. I say generally speaking because they arrange the books in a different order in Christianity than in Judaism. And the Protestants and the Catholics have different Bibles when it comes to the Old Testament. So the Catholics have some additional books that the Protestants don't. So it depends on which Old Testament you're talking about. This is more in line with the Protestant version. So let me tell you about another empire. The Persian Empire, who allowed the Jews to return to Judea and rebuild the temple, begin the Second Temple period, is then conquered by the Greek Empire. The Greeks are led initially by Alexander the Great. And with the conquest of the Greeks, we have the introduction of Greek language and Greek culture into the Middle East. This is what we call the Hellenic period. And this has a big influence on Judaism and subsequently Christianity and Islam as well. For example, when you get to the 1st century and you have the start of Christianity, what language do the first Christians write their documents in? It's not Hebrew. It's not Aramaic. It's Greek, right? So the Gospels are written in Greek. The epistles of the Apostle Paul are written in Greek. Why? Because of the influence that the Greek conquest had on the region. So Greek becomes widespread throughout the Middle East. It's at this time that the Tanakh, which is largely in Hebrew, there's a little bit in Aramaic, is translated into Greek. That Greek translation is called the Septuagint. And now this Greek version allows more people who aren't Jews access to the text because they know Greek, right? They couldn't, Hebrew was not a widely known language. It was a language unique to the Jews, but Greek was widely known, right? So now basically people throughout this empire have access to a Greek text. But the Greeks, of course, weren't monotheists. They were polytheists. And we know, looking back at the 10 Commandments, that Judaism emphasizes monotheism. Initially monarchy, but then monotheism. So Yahweh is one, and his sacred temple, no graven images, right? Yahweh doesn't have a big statue of himself in there. But what did the Greeks do? The Greeks decide that the Jewish Yahweh is just like their Zeus. So they build a statue of Zeus and install Zeus in the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem. That doesn't go over well. And you have a Jewish revolt against the Greeks to overthrow them. So even though all these different empires are conquering, of course, the Israelites still hope to see the return of their monarchy and Jewish independence once again. Here you see a map showing the extent of the Greek Empire. We have, of course, the city in Egypt called Alexandria. That's named after Alexander the Great. It was founded by him. And over here, you can see the extent to which the Greeks reached. They went all the way to the Indus River Valley, and it's after the Greek conquest in the region that we'll see the rise of the Mauryan Empire. And of course, it's the 3rd Mauryan emperor that converts to Buddhism. Remember Ashoka? Ashoka is part of the dynasty that emerges in the wake of the Greek conquest in South Asia. So the Jews now find themselves ruled by the Greeks, and the Greeks get absorbed by the Romans. So then the Jews find themselves ruled by the Romans. That means that the old kingdom of Israel has faced invasion and conquest by the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and then the Romans. As this experience has shaped Jewish identity for centuries now, there develops this belief, this hope that one day a descendant from the great King David, from that royal line, from the house of David will come, will reappear in the world and restore the old Jewish monarchy, the old Israelite monarchy in Jerusalem, restore the United Kingdom of Israel, and be able to usher in a new age of power and prosperity and peace and righteousness in the world. So that develops into the Jewish belief in the coming of a new anointed one, a new Mushiah, a new Messiah. And still today in the 21st century, this is a core belief in Judaism, that one day a anointed one, a new king from the line of David will come and will usher in this new age, the so-called Messianic age. Now, throughout Jewish history, there have been various movements led by people that some people believe to be the awaited Messiah. And of course, one of those movements develops into Christianity, but there were many others as well. So this whole idea of an awaited Messiah from the line of David actually sows the seeds for many new religious movements. The most notable, of course, is Christianity, but there have been several others as well, some of which die out, others which exist but kind of modify in various ways over time. And we will return to this concept, of course, when we learn about Christianity in the weeks to come. To conclude my lecture today, I want to just set the stage for the Roman period. So the Greeks are succeeded by the Romans. And at this time, the Jewish community is not at all united into one single Judaism per se. We have the old type of Judaism centered around the sacrifice of animals to Yahweh at the temple. once the second temple is constructed, that old type of Judaism can return. So that's the Judaism associated with this faction called the Sadducees. The Sadducees are the old priestly form of Judaism centered around rituals at the temple. But then you have the type of Judaism that developed during the exile, when the temple had been destroyed and people had to find other ways to worship Yahweh, and the texts were written, and people who had knowledge of the text emerged as new religious authorities. That's the faction we know as the Pharisees, and it's the Pharisees who will develop into rabbinic Judaism, or Judaism as we know it today. Two other factions include the Essenes. The Essenes are Jewish ascetics who are believe the end of the world is coming, so they withdraw from society, and they're busy purifying themselves, cleansing themselves of sin so that they're ready when the world ends and God's judgment happens. And then we have a group, the Zealots. The Zealots are basically militant Jewish nationalists who want to liberate the land of Israel by force from the Romans and restore the old monarchy, and they're willing to fight in God's cause to do it. So when we explore first century Judaism on Monday, we'll talk about how a Jewish revolt goes very wrong in the first century against the Romans. And in the aftermath of that, only one of these four factions will survive and thus dictate the subsequent history and development of the religion we know as Judaism. All right, that is all for today. I hope you have a great weekend, and I will see you back here on Monday. Bye.